Begin with the simplest truth. By the middle of the Second World War, American air defense stopped guessing. To the men who stood beside heavy guns under cold skies, the change felt almost magical, but the magic was measurement. Radar sent out a quick pulse, listened for the faint echo from an aircraft's skin, and returned three essentials: direction, distance, and height. An automatic gun director, an analog computer turning electrical currents into angles, swallowed those numbers and predicted where the target would be by the time a shell reached it. Power-driven mounts obeyed the director's orders without argument. The gun crews rammed high-velocity shells that no longer needed a clockwork timer set by hand. A proximity fuse inside could sense the aircraft's presence and detonate at the right instant, spraying fragments into a space the gun layer could not see. What people later called radar-guided anti-aircraft was not a single device. It was a loop. Radar finds, director predicts, guns obey, fuse finishes the problem, and once the loop closed, the sky seemed smaller to anyone who trespassed inside it. Put names to the parts so they stop sounding like legend and start sounding like equipment. The tracking radar that earned so much respect was a compact, dish-equipped set capable of locking onto a single moving target and following it automatically as it crossed the sky. Its centimeter band wavelength, short enough to make a tight beam from a small dish, gave it both precision and the ability to ignore much of the ground's messy reflections. In practice, the radar crew swung the dish to a blip on the plan position display, captured it, and let the servo systems do the rest. The dish moved like a watchful head. The target stayed in the center. The range gate marched with it. The set emitted a quiet, insistent hum that made veterans think of a breathing animal. The gun director, an analog computer in a steel box, transformed raw geometry into the future. Ballistics demand prediction. If a shell needs a few seconds to climb and arc, then any angle read directly from a telescope is already obsolete. The director accepted the radar's range, bearing, and elevation, watched how those values changed from one instant to the next, and solved for where the aircraft would be when the shell arrived, not where it was when the radar last looked. Inside the director, spinning resolvers, gear trains, and electrical amplifiers whispered to one another. Operators turned small hand wheels to feed in muzzle velocity, air temperature, wind, and shell weight. Transformers and potentiometers did the arithmetic as fast as the enemy could fly. A clutch sent the computed sight data by cable to powered mounts. Without drama and without romance, the barrels slewed as if tugged by an invisible hand. Nothing about this loop mattered if the shell itself behaved like a blind stone. That is why the proximity fuse altered psychology as much as it altered lethality. Earlier in the war, gunners adjusted mechanical time fuses with a key, trying to detonate a shell near an estimated position in space. It worked, but the error bars were wide, and a near miss was a waste. The new fuse carried its own sensor, a tiny radio that felt the aircraft's presence as a change in reflected energy and commanded detonation at the best instant for fragments to bite aluminum. Suddenly, the old bargain changed. The fire control loop no longer demanded that the crew be exactly right. It asked that they be right enough for the clever fuse to do the rest. Near misses became hits. Ladders of ranging bursts climbed more quickly to a target's path. The intervals between first salvo and the moment when the air began to sparkle with correct height bursts grew visibly shorter. To a visitor, the battery looked like a modest village of trailers and trucks, cables and headsets, concrete pads and sandbags. There was a radar van with its dish swiveling above the hedgerow, a director trailer where uniformed mathematicians turned wheels and watched needles, a power truck grumbling under load, and gun pits where teams moved like practiced dancers. In reality, doctrine split responsibilities across many hands, so the loop never depended on any one person's intuition. A search radar might scan a sector and hand a plot to the tracking set through the voice of a controller. The tracking set would lock on, a phrase that made sense as soon as you watched the dish glue itself to a target's climb and saw the plan, position blip stop wandering. The director team would announce automatic control, and the gun pits would shift from the sighting telescopes mounted on their barrels to the silent authority of the electrical data arriving through thick umbilicals. A battery commander stood at the center with a field telephone and a headset on, watching the pattern develop and deciding when to open or check fire. The language of this world deserves a translation so the later story can stand without jargon. When crews spoke of line of sight, they meant the straight ray from dish to aircraft. The Earth's curve, hills, and buildings could cut it and turn the best radar into a blind thing. When they spoke of clutter, they meant unwanted echoes, rain, waves, forest, factory steel that thickened the scope with false suggestions. When they spoke of solution, they meant that the director had settled on a stable prediction. In the headset, voices softened when the solution stabilized, because the tension of chasing error gave way to the calm of repeating numbers. When they spoke of pattern, they meant the constellation of bursts in the sky around the target's path, the nearest thing a ground crew had to a visual conversation with a distant aircraft. Imagine the rhythms of an engagement from the ground's point of view. A blip appears at the search set's edge, high and faint. The controller's voice carries the bearing and estimated height. The tracking crew throws the dish and the dish obeys. A brighter pip begins to walk steadily across the scope. In the director van, needles flick and then, satisfyingly, settle. The hand wheels stop skittering under the operator's fingertips. In the pits, elevation and traverse repeaters begin to move without human hands, and the gun captains feel relief because the slow, aching grind of manual laying is over for now. The battery commander listens to the reports, relays a batteries release, and a tremor runs through 4 or 6 concrete rings as shells go home and breaches slam shut. A first string of bursts climbs a ladder through empty air. A few adjustments come from the director, numbers barked with confidence. The next string opens not behind the aircraft, but where the aircraft is going. If the shell noses carry the clever fuse, one burst in 3 becomes a knife rather than a shout. If the aircraft hesitates, if it banks to avoid one pattern and turns, however slightly, into the next, the interval between mathematics and metal collapses, and the sky answers with a bright, instantaneous, there. The men who lived inside this loop called it work. They stared at green glass and spinning drums, cursed bad power, slung cables over their shoulders, and argued about routine maintenance because if the generator hiccuped at the wrong moment, the entire edifice would collapse into silence. They drilled the handoffs until the handoffs felt boring. They learned to trust the director when their instincts still wanted to follow the aircraft with their eyes, and they learned slowly that the enemy learned too. Early in a unit's life, the first time a properly prepared battery answered a raid, the results could feel unfair. Later, the aircraft would come lower, weave more aggressively, hug terrain, or spread so that one predictive solution could not service all of them. The loop was a contest, and the other team wanted to break it. That is the foundation. To understand why prisoners of war spoke about shock, why some Luftwaffe men talked about invisible eyes and mechanical brains, as if they had met a new class of weapon, you must feel how impersonal, how repeatable, and how calm the American loop became once the parts were together and the crews were trained. It is one thing to fly through a barrage of time-fused shells, whose bursts thicken and thin as human judgment wrestles with distance. It is another to bank and see precise bursts arrive where your nose will be, not where it was, and to see that pattern find you again and again, as if the ground could read your future. The later chapters will show the human faces, the dates, the development decisions, and the numbers that proved the point. For now, hold on to the loop. Radar finds, director predicts, guns obey, fuse finishes. That is what the POWs met across the wire when they tried to explain what had happened to them, and that is where our story begins before we lay a timeline across it. The moment we leave definitions, we will have to pin down when this loop actually reached maturity and where, because no soldier or airman fights an average. This system did not arrive all at once, everywhere, fully formed. It assembled itself piece by piece across years, and it flowered in some theatres before others. The next part supplies that backbone so every later scene can hang on real dates. An early war of prototypes, a middle war of integration, and a late war when the loop sang. Begin on the far side of the Atlantic with a simple exchange. In the autumn of 1940, a small British delegation brought a suitcase of secrets to North America. Out of that suitcase poured the compact metal heart of centimeter-band radar, a cavity magnetron capable of squeezing radio energy into tight, manageable beams. In laboratories in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in workshops where American industry could scale precision into quantity, the magnetron's potential became hardware. The American story of radar-guided anti-aircraft fire therefore starts before America is in the war. It starts in a room where engineers turn a British invention into an American production line, and it continues in the kind of institutions that can build an idea into a doctrine. A university laboratory that behaves like a factory of experiments, a signal corps that can sign contracts, and a network of officers who can translate laboratory demonstrations into field training schedules. By 1941, test ranges in the United States were cluttered with what witnesses later described as ridiculous contraptions: trailers festooned with antennas, oscilloscopes blinking like bottled lightning, cables laid across sand like spaghetti. The phrase fire control still meant men with binoculars and mechanical directors designed for visible targets. The early shortwave search radars could tell you there was a target in a sector and at what range, but they did not aim guns with enough precision to cut down the guesswork. The radar-to-gun handshake was clumsy. The analog directors of the day, ingenious devices originally intended to help visible sighting, were uncomfortably separated from what the radar sets produced. Worse, the guns themselves were not yet wired to obey external commands without friction. The loop existed in spirit, but it rattled and stalled like an engine with mismatched parts. What changes in 1942 is not a single breakthrough, but the accumulation of fit. Centimeter-band radar made a new kind of tracking set possible, one that could lock onto a single moving target and follow it automatically. Engineers married that precision to a purpose-built analog computer that could ingest live radar data without translation and output aiming commands suited for powered mounts. And those mounts, built in parallel, gained the muscle to slew heavy barrels with the kind of speed and steadiness that made prediction worthwhile. Behind the laboratory doors, a cathedral of test rigs pressed the parts together. A dish feeding a cable, feeding a director, feeding a mount. On ranges where fragile prototypes had once sagged on sawhorses, the battery now resembled the later war, not the earlier one. In 1943, the field begins to see the first confident deployments of the radar-director pairing. Units that had trained with binoculars and clinometers learned to trust the calm voice from the tracking van. Gun pits that had been filled with hand wheels became quiet because the repeaters took over. The difference soldiers felt when the new loop replaced the old was not dramatic at first. It was relief. The battery could follow a target more smoothly, respond to a maneuver more quickly, and place a pattern where it needed to be with fewer ranging ladders. Reports from training grounds read like notes from a new instrument section that finally tuned its strings together. The late months of 1943 and the first half of 1944 add the last essential element, a fuse that could turn rough prediction into dependable damage. The proximity fuse's path to the front was a tale of its own concerns about secrecy, fears about a clever enemy capturing and copying it, and the need to prove that a small, rugged radio could survive the brute forces inside a gun barrel. By the time those fears slackened and production surged, the war's calendar had moved forward and the front had changed. When the fuse joined the radar director pairing in strength, the loop acquired a new confidence. It no longer had to aim for an exact shell burst in a particular cubic yard of air. It had to aim for a sufficiently thin slice of sky and let the fuse's own senses close the last inch. Stories from the period change tone right about here. Crews stop marveling at how neatly the sights hold target and start counting how many near misses are now counted as effective bursts. By late 1944, In both the European and Pacific theaters, mature combinations of search radar, tracking radar, director, powered mounts, and improved fuses could be found wherever critical assets demanded heavy protection. The bottleneck was no longer whether the loop worked. It was whether the parts could be delivered and trained into coherence quickly enough to match operations. Ports handling mountains of cargo, cities worried about night raiders, beachheads that could not afford to be harassed from above. These were the places where the loop sang first and loudest. For aviators who had grown used to the old pattern of heavy, noisy barrages that threw metal into the sky in the hope of intersecting a path, the new pattern was unnerving. Bursts arrived where an aircraft was going, not where it had been, and even when pilots broke one pattern, they often found the next already forming. Winter 1944 into spring 1945 is the period when memories later recorded the most shock. The novelty had compounded with deployment density. The kinks in communication were ironed out. The training syllabi were no longer improvisations but polished routines. The spare parts bins were, for a change, not empty. This maturity does not mean invulnerability. Weather still made fools of planners. Ground clutter still hid low-flying intruders. Even the best radar goes blind behind a hill or a grain silo. Jamming and deception arrived as countermeasures, as any measured system will summon a measured response. But on the whole, the loop's strength had stopped being a rumor and become a logistical fact. When a target entered a defended sector, the defenders could do something about it within seconds, not minutes, and they could keep doing it while the target tried to think of a way to escape. Set against this scaffolding of dates, the human side of the story gains focus. The prisoner who told an interrogator that "the Americans have guns that think" was not trying to write poetry. He was trying to explain what it felt like to face a timing of bursts that seemed to anticipate motion rather than trail it. The crew chief, who insisted that the dish knew, was not being superstitious. He was admitting that an electric beam could do what a man with a telescope could not do as smoothly. And the battery commander who said that after integration you could hear the certainty in the director's voice was not exaggerating. In a loop made of devices and doctrine, the transfer of calm is contagious. These dates are more than a calendar. They are a way to read reports without being fooled by averages. A memory from 1942 that describes clumsy handoffs and unreliable mounts belongs to the period before the parts fit. A memory from late 1944 that describes short intervals between first salvo and effective bursts belongs to the period when the fuse joined the loop and the crews had drilled for months. If you hold this timeline in your head, later anecdotes stop fighting with one another. The war is not one thing, it is a corridor of changes. The loop we are going to watch in action did not exist in 1941. It stretched and thickened across 1942 and 1943. And it reached a crisp voice by late 1944 into 1945. Now that the backbone of dates is in place, the next step is to give the story a spine of numbers the narrative can keep touching, not as a list to memorize but as friendly handholds. A single radar sets approximate range on a bomber-sized target, a director's settling time, a gun's rate of fire, a shell's weight, a typical battery's footprint on the ground. These are the figures that let later moments feel concrete and scale-aware. The next section offers those facts as fluent prose rather than a table, so they can be woven into the scenes that follow without breaking the flow. If you were to stand with a pencil and a notebook beside an American heavy anti-aircraft battery in the last 2 years of the war and write down the numbers that mattered, you would not start with the gun. You would start with the beam. A centimeter band, tracking radar, once locked, could follow a bomber-sized target out beyond 10 miles with an accuracy that made the director's job honest. The beam itself was narrow enough to ignore much of the world's clutter, and the automatic tracking kept the target centered even as pilots tried to dance. Range gates drifted as serenely as a tide once the capture was complete, and the rate at which the range changed told as much about an aircraft's intentions as its direction. An operator who watched that rate learn to move would describe it later like listening to a motor rev and idle in the distance. The director's settling time, how long it took the analog brain to stop hunting and decide on a solution, mattered more to crews than any abstract spec sheet rating. In good hands and with a cooperative target, a solution could stabilize in seconds, which meant that the interval between first detection and the first meaningful pattern of bursts compressed to an experience that felt unfair to the attacker. Aim points traveled endlessly for the human eye, but inside the director, the aim point was tamed by the arithmetic of relative motion. The hand wheels on the front panel, small as they looked, carried the weight of the atmosphere and the propellant. An experienced operator could taste when colder air was slowing muzzle velocity and adjust accordingly. Another would take wind down as if cutting a steak in measured motions that became muscle memory. Now, to the throwing arm. The 90mm gun that formed the backbone of many defenses could throw a shell heavy enough to disassemble an aircraft from surprising distances. To a man in the pit, the important measures were not the catalogue entries but the way the weapon moved under orders. Each mount was powered to traverse and elevate smoothly in response to the director's commands. When the repeaters on the gun began to chase their commanded lines and then match them, the crew felt like oarsmen in a boat that had finally found the river's heart. Rates of fire in the high teens per minute were not unusual under drill, though real engagements always stole a few strokes. The 120mm gun, present where altitude demanded it, traded raw volume for reach and fragment mass. It was a steadier, deeper voice in the battery's chorus. Shells became characters in the story because their innards carried the loop's faith to the target. A time fuse demanded that a setter machine on the line or a crewman's key give it a guess. A proximity fuse carried its own ghost of a radar and waited for the last instant to act. To a crew chief, the difference felt like swapping a promise for a plan. The shell's weight is worth remembering only because it explains the sweat. Every piece of this elegant system ultimately leaned on men willing to heave heavy cylinders into open throats again and again, while electricity made all the delicate choices. And yet those men would insist that the most delicate part of the whole enterprise was not the fuse or the magnetron. It was alignment calibration as a daily religion. A badly aligned repeater would ruin a prediction without ever announcing its mischief. A poorly leveled mount would sing the wrong note. A battery's footprint on the ground answers a question you might have already felt asking: how did all of this live in a field? Think in circles and lines rather than rectangles. Gun pits in a rough ring gave overlapping arcs of fire. The radar van liked open angles to the horizon and firm, level ground. The director wanted to be near the center, with cables short enough to be reliable and long enough to be safe. The power truck lived where its rumble would not spoil men's hearing. The plotting table and the telephone switch lived under canvas that everybody pretended kept the weather out. Between these islands ran cables that carried both power and arithmetic. A newcomer often found these cables first, stepping over black ropes that told him he was inside the battery's nervous system. At night they gleamed with dew. In rain they disappeared into mud. In snow they became frail ribs under footprints. The numbers that matter most to the story's truth are the ones that bind geometry to time. From lock to first effective pattern, minutes became tens of seconds in the best cases. If an aircraft held a straight course, correction from ladder to cage followed an audible logic: open, closer, close, and then the sudden fury of bursts that were exactly where the eye did not expect them. If the aircraft maneuvered, the correction did not panic. It anticipated. Underneath the language, that is what the analog director bought and what radar made possible. A capacity to live in the shape of the next few seconds rather than in the echo of the last few. One more figure deserves a place here because it colors prisoner testimony later. Ceiling. High-flying intruders who once could rely on altitude as a seatbelt discovered that the loop reached farther than rumor had promised. The tall guns and the predictive brain lengthened the vertical reach of ground fire. This did not make each burst a kill. Nothing ever does. It did make each pass through a defended sector, a calculation rather than a habit. Airmen speak in their own numbers. Rate of climb, indicated airspeed, manifold pressure. When they crossed into regions where the ground's numbers could speak to them at equal volume, shock followed. There is a temptation to corral these facts into a neat table and be done with them. Resist it. The battery was not a spreadsheet. It was a human choreography driven by a ring of electricity, and its numbers are most honest when tucked inside scenes. When a later page says that the director settled quickly, you can remember the needles calming down and the operator relaxing his fingers. When a later page says that bursts appeared ahead of a turn, you can remember that the shell needed seconds to fly and that the computer lived in those seconds, without complaint. When someone behind wire says they knew where we were going, you can nod, not because of superstition, but because a predictor armed with fresh data can appear to read minds. This spine of living numbers becomes the standard against which myths will push. If a story claims that radar-guided guns never missed, the memory of line of sight and clutter returns like a loyal friend to correct the exaggeration. If a story insists that the proximity fuse aimed the gun by itself, the image of the director sweating out wind and temperature stands up to say otherwise. If a bit of post-war rhetoric calls the system a miracle, the heaviness of the shells and the stubbornness of the generator and the fragility of alignment bring the conversation back to earth. Machines do remarkable things. People keep them honest. Weather and terrain show them their limits. With equipment described and the working numbers within reach, there remains one more essential layer before we dramatize an engagement and step into the cockpit and the gun pit alike. Claims about weapons, their reach, their speed, their supposed invincibility accumulate a fog as surely as shells produce smoke. The next part offers a simple method for reading that fog without losing the story's pulse. It is a set of guardrails. It protects the narrative from being hijacked by rumor or flattered by propaganda. It tells you which voices to trust and how to keep even trustworthy voices from wandering. Once those guardrails are up, we can walk into the firing loop with confidence that the scene's drama will be supported by receipts rather than drowned by them. Weapons live in two worlds at once. They inhabit the world of unromantic numbers, where a ring of copper oxidizes and a bearing runs hot, and they inhabit the world of stories where fear and pride make their own weather. Anyone who tries to explain why a group of prisoners sounded astonished when they spoke about American heavy anti-aircraft, fire must move carefully between these worlds. Move too far into the numbers and the human truth evaporates. Move too far into the story and the numbers rebel. The first guardrail, therefore, is a pledge to stand with one foot on the ground and one on the stage. We will let documents, logs, and test reports tell us what was possible and how often it happened. We will let voices recorded near the time tell us what it felt like, and when the two do not match perfectly, we will lay the mismatch in the open rather than try to hide it. A second guardrail is respect for time. A claim about radar-guided guns made in 1942 belongs to a different ecosystem than an identical claim made in 1945. The parts had not yet married properly. The training had not yet worn grooves into muscle memory. The logistics chain still stumbled over its own feet. If a veteran tells us that in early 1943 the handoff between search set and tracking set was fussy, we do not correct him with a 1945 technical manual and call him mistaken. We let his scene live on its own date. If another veteran remembers proximity fuses in a place that did not yet field them in numbers, we consider whether he is telescoping months together or using the nearest available name for a phenomenon he could feel without being able to dissect it. The calendar is not pedantry, it is context, and it keeps honest men from being made to sound like fools. Third, the way memory handles danger and noise must be acknowledged without condescension. In a cockpit inside a formation at night, or under a canopy flooded with sunlight while the altimeter unwinds, a pilot or crewman cannot draw neat diagrams. He hears bursts, feels the aircraft tremble, watches his lead turn and holds the turn, sees sparkles in the air that might be time-fused or proximity-fused bursts or reflections on his own canopy. When he later says, "They were ahead of us," it is not an engineer's proof. It is a witness's ringtone. Our pledge is to treat those signals with respect and to braid them with ground logs when we can. A gun battery leaves a different kind of trail. Rounds fired, aim points shifted by so many mils, notes about power fluctuations and alignment checks. Where those logs exist, they translate memory into a complementary language. Where they do not, we do not pretend otherwise. The fourth guardrail guards against the seduction of absolutes. Always, never, and anywhere are words that terrified people and proud people lean on when they want to win an argument fast. They are almost always wrong in detail, even when they feel right in spirit. Radar-guided guns did not make aircraft of all kinds vulnerable in all conditions at all times. They made certain aircraft in certain profiles much more vulnerable than they had been, and they did so with a consistency that made planners change routes and altitudes. The proximity fuse did not guarantee a kill with every shell. It narrowed the margin between estimation and effect. Ground clutter did not evaporate. It had to be worked around. Weather remained a sovereign nation. A measured system cannot defeat the planet. It can only make a persuasive case against complacency. Fifth, we will be frank about sources. Post-war technical monographs are wonderful things. They explain how systems really worked when no one is shooting. They also tend to file down the rough edges of reality. Operational research reports written while the war still burned bring a different truth. They are smudged with the grease of improvisation. They are limited by what could be measured between missions. They are sometimes wrong in details because the tape broke or the clerk was tired. Interrogation reports of prisoners on both sides carry their own fogs. Self-protection, bravado, genuine ignorance about how the other side's devices worked, and the strange human need to see a pattern in whatever hurt us most recently. None of this makes any category useless. It means that each category must sit in the right chair at the table. Finally, there is a guardrail about tone. It is easy to glorify cleverness and forget the cost. The loop that turned radar pips into bursts at the right height and position did not pay its rent merely in captured memoirs. It paid in crates shipped, maintenance hours logged, instructors yelling over generator noise, and crews practicing in sleet because a set would not learn its own settings. The men who flew into those bursts did not experience a debate. They experienced shock and fire and the drag of a damaged wing, or else they experienced the relief of seeing the patterns slide behind them after a good decision. Our sentences must be proportioned to those stakes. When something is impressive, we can say so plainly. When something is limited, we can say so plainly. Neither judgment needs trumpet fanfares. With the guardrails in place, we can now enter the firing loop with cameras and calm. We can stand in the radar van and listen to the operator's voice change when the lock is good. We can sit on a metal stool inside the director trailer and watch a young sergeant's hands do trigonometry in muscle memory as he trims wind and temperature. We can crouch in a gun pit and feel the mount obey the silent will of cables. And then we can climb into a bomber's right-hand seat and watch burst patterns appear not as random fireworks but as readable sentences. Here, they have a solution. Here, they are still searching. Here, the proximity fuses are arriving where we mean to be. The scene that follows in the next section will not be a myth-making tableau. It will be a reconstruction of seconds that felt like a theft of choice to one side and like a vindication of drill to the other. The operators on the ground will speak in clipped confirmations. The airmen will speak in startled questions. Between them, the loop will do what it was designed to do. Remove guesswork from killing. The path from here threads straight into action. We have defined the loop so that unfamiliar equipment feels like furniture in a room rather than magic in a fog. We have planted a timeline so that claims arrive with dates and do not blur into a narrative that never happened. We have given ourselves walking numbers so that the later scene will not float away into abstraction. And we have built a method for listening to both technical documents and human voices without making either carry a weight it cannot bear. With all of that, we can finally talk about what the loop felt like in the seconds that turned a track on a scope into sharp air and falling metal, and we can watch how the men who survived those seconds tried to name what had taken place. The first sound is the generator's steady growl, a bass note under everything, and above it the quiet, insect-like buzz from the tracking van as the dish swivels against a darkening sky. A controller's voice slips through the headset with a bearing and a height that place the aircraft at the edge of imagination rather than at the edge of vision. Someone marks a grease pencil dot on a plexiglass overlay, and the world begins to contract around that dot. The dish climbs, steadies, and then the remark everybody waits for arrives with disarming calm. Lock. In the director trailer, the needles that had been hunting now ease towards stillness. The young sergeant at the hand wheels trims wind as if smoothing a tablecloth, grunts about a quarter turn on air temperature, and lets the machine talk to the mounts. Out at the pits, men who have been covering the sights with their eyes alone because it feels respectful to do so, take their hands off and watch the repeater pointers pull their barrels into alignment with something they cannot see. The first salvos are always both ritual and test. The gun captains sing out the rhythm because breathing keeps time better than intellect when stress tightens the chest. The shells slide home, the breech blocks jump, barrels recoil, and a line of growing white beads hangs in the sky where there had been only colourless air a heartbeat before. A ladder of bursts climbs toward the path the aircraft will take if its pilot keeps his promise to inertia. The director accepts the evidence of that ladder and inches the solution forward. In the tracking van, the operator's right hand rests on a tuning knob that does not need to be touched but gives the hand a home. His left hovers near a switch he will not need to throw. He stares at the scope with his whole body, leans when the blip leans, and then laughs softly because he can feel the rhythm settle into a phrase that feels like a song. The battery commander, who does not care for poetry at this hour, asks for reports in the same tone he uses to ask for coffee, and the reports come back in a chain that has been rehearsed enough times to carry itself. Everything that can be routine is routine, which is the point. The aircraft gives the first reply by refusing to be a line. The rate of change needle, that exquisite translator of space into intention, slides and then tips. The operator calls the drift before anyone outside can guess it, and the director adds the new motion to the arithmetic. Down in the pits, the traversing motors make a round, patient sound like a cat settling, then a firmer growl as they catch up. The next pattern appears not behind the new path but ahead of it, and the men in the pits begin to talk less and move more. Someone swears when a cable snags, someone else taps a stubborn pin with a practiced flick, and the crew chief, a man whose shoulders carry 2 decades of stored annoyance with machines, warns the nearest mount to mind its elevation serpent because he can hear a bearing he does not like. The sergeant at the hand wheels ignores this because he must, and trims a whisper of wind again. There is nothing theatrical about the moment the bursts begin to look like a trap. It happens quietly, almost with embarrassment, as if everyone involved is under orders not to make a fuss. The pattern tightens. The air seems to twinkle in the exact volume that imagination had predicted, and then the thing every arithmetic hopes for but cannot guarantee arrives in a bottle-green flash and a ragged streak that begins as a line and ends as a tumble. No one shouts victory because there is no victory yet, only a change of work. The tracking operator rides the echo while it grows noisy with debris, because the battery commander might want one more string to make sure, and because letting go too early feels like betrayal. The director holds his solution because a damaged aircraft has habits that can be read if you know them. The drag that comes from a torn panel, the slow right-hand bias of a wounded pilot, the sag that an engine at partial power introduces into the numbers. The guns answer as if this were still practice. When silence finally falls, an artificial silence made of men not speaking rather than of the generator actually quieting sound, returns in pieces. Spent casings knock against steel. Hot smells get their own vocabulary. Somebody who always jokes after the last string makes his joke again because it keeps fear from hardening into superstition. The commander collects what he needs for the log with the same manner he uses to correct a private's bootlaces, because form is a ladder one can climb out of chaos. The tracking van goes dark except for the console's pale spill, and the operator rubs his eyes as if pushing invisible grit to the side. He has lived for minutes inside a new set of seconds, and emerging is always slightly disorienting. The best crews are unsentimental. They worry the small things because the small things are how a loop fails. The chief of section who heard a bearing protest in the mount will not let the men coil cables until he has listened again with his cheek against the metal. The sergeant who trims wind will later write a note about a gust that did not behave like a gust because weather is a stealth saboteur. Someone will argue for stronger discipline in the handoff from search to track. Someone else will argue that the handoff went beautifully and nothing needs changing. They will both be right because in measured work the perfect is a moving target and chasing it keeps men honest. But there is a way they all stand when they know the loop sang. It is not pride. It is the loosening of jaw muscles held tight for too long, the click of breath that a narrow chest had forgotten to take, and the set of the shoulders that will, in a few minutes, accept the weight of crates and cables without complaint because the mathematics made sense. Above all, the loop teaches a taste for tempo. Once you hear how smoothly it can move from blip to burst, you begin to measure every rumour against that rhythm. When a visitor says the guns were lucky, you remember how the range rate stabilized like a held note, and you smile. When someone insists that the dish does the killing, you think about the sweating men in the pits, the stubborn pin that needed the practiced flick, the smell of hot oil where elevation meets gravity, and you let the comment pass without comment. The loop is not magic. It is a stack of fragile disciplines, and when the stack holds, it feels like certainty. This is what the ground knows. The sky knows something else, and the story cannot be complete until those seconds have been retold from the place where bursts don't look like geometry but like fate. From the right-hand seat, the world is a grey plane and a scratched panel, the tremor of a formation passing through uneven air, the habit of glancing at a leader's wingtips more often than at the horizon, because staying in position is the difference between an orderly sky and a fatal collision. The crew is a chorus you carry in your bones, the measured call from the navigator, the engine's vow repeated at a comforting pitch, the radio's occasional cough. The first sign that the ground has taken an interest is not sight but texture. The air develops grit. You feel it before you see it. Then the first bursts appear behind and below, and the small part of your mind that catalogues danger sets them in a familiar drawer labelled time fire and returns to the work of remaining a stable element in a moving geometry. The next bursts step up the ladder with disagreeable efficiency, and this you have seen before as well, so you bank a whisper to shear the pattern without bumping the man next to you off his line. What you have not seen before is the thing that comes next. A page of air ahead of the formation flickers as if someone had switched on a constellation, and the glitter sits not where you were, but where you are going to be if you keep the promises made by metal and inertia. It looks like foreknowledge. It feels like treachery. The body's first response is to turn harder, to prove that a choice still exists, and the proof arrives as fragments tapping the skin and a sudden loosening of the stick that is not loosening at all, but damage speaking through the controls. Someone in the crew shouts a name, someone else swallows the name and calls a number because altitude is always a number. Someone, perhaps you, says a word that would have earned a rebuke from a schoolmaster, but earns a nod from a man who has been here before. There is no time to decide whether the cleverness resides in the shell or in the hand that threw it. You look where you are going to look because the eye's muscle memory cannot be retrained in a second, and the next page of glitter meets you there, as if punctuation had been placed in your sentence by a stranger. The formation leans left in a domino of obedience and drags you with it. You take the lean and add just enough of your own descent to avoid a collision, and now your private geometry no longer matches the geometry of the bursts. A few look mercifully stupid, far behind, where the old logic of time fuses would put them. A few look new and intimate, explaining nothing and convincing you of everything. One bright blossom opens close on the quarter, and the aircraft shivers. The tremor moves through the frame as if it were a word uttered in another room. You smell a hot sweetness, and you do not have the time to name it. The air creaks. Later, after the field and the shouting and the loss, after the long walk that concludes with wire and a gate and a new quiet, you try to give your captors something other than surrender. You offer the story of what you saw, and the story leaks through your fingers because sky speaking and ground listening use different verbs. You say that the bursts were in front of the turn, and someone with a pencil on the other side of the table writes predictive. You say the first ladder felt ordinary, and the second ladder felt like a trap, and a man you do not know, who was once a boy with a screwdriver in a university basement, writes solutions settled and trims. You say the shells had a way of finding you, even when the altitude changed in a disciplined way, and the pencil writes VT as if two letters could carry the smell of hot sweetness that still will not leave your voice. Inside the wire, explanations have their own weather. Men speak with authority whose only credential is charisma, and you listen because listening is how the day passes. Someone says the Americans have a ray that reaches up and tells the shells when to burst, a single beam that scribbles in the air. Someone else says the guns themselves have become autopilots, that no human hands turn them, that a radio brain does everything while the crews stand and watch. You keep your counsel because you know the world is not so simple, and also because telling other men that their consolation is inaccurate is a poor way to make friends. But privately, in the space where the body keeps memory separate from speech, you remember the way the pattern appeared, where you intended to be, and you make peace with the idea that someone on the ground has learned to read the future in the most boring possible way, by doing mathematics faster than you can change your mind. There is bitterness tucked in under the shock, not at the enemy's cleverness which earns respect grudgingly, but at the way habit betrayed you. You had learned to read the old barrages as if they were a language. You could tell when the ground was guessing, and when it guessed well, you could perform the dance that caused it to guess wrong in the next measure. Your hands learned the steps, and if you carried a talisman at all, it was not in your pocket but in your muscles. To find that the dance now occurred in a room where the music had changed felt like humiliation. It took a day for anger to find its words, and when the words arrived, they were not noble. Why did no one tell us? Why were we sent at that height, along that line? Why did we fly the old pattern into the new net? Blame is as human as breath, and it filled the barracks with warmth on evenings when the air turned cold. Capture reduces men and equalizes them. When the guard passes, the talk returns to mechanics because mechanics are a way of reclaiming self-respect. The man who has watched a dish from the ground explains incorrectly. It turns out how the dish writes the shell's fate, and you find yourself correcting him, gently, because it matters to you that the world be put back together in proportion. You say that the dish is an eye, and that the real trick is not the seeing, but the thinking that follows, and you phrase it clumsily because you do not have the right nouns. He nods and changes the subject to bread. You let it go. Humility creeps in where certainty once stood. It is not altogether unwelcome. The night brings dreams engineered by physics rather than by poets. In them, the sky never becomes empty. There is always another set of sparkles in the place you almost choose to go. You wake with a small start, stare at the wooden slats above, and listen to another man's breath until it steadies you. Morning brings a new habit. When you look up at the guard tower's roofline and see a pigeon take wing, you do not think what you used to think about flight and escape. You think about lead angles and the next few seconds. You think like the ground. That is the measure of the technology's victory, and it is not recorded on any scoreboard. It has borrowed your vocabulary and made you speak in its tense. Stories grown in heat and hurry rarely survive the cool room of detail, and yet the cool room does not erase the heat. The first myth that rises like steam from fresh experience declares that the new guns never miss. The cool room sets out its instruments and demonstrates gently that line of sight still governs all radio work, that a hill can make a genius blind, that rain and sea and city steel can fill a screen with ghosts, that men still sweat over cables and bearings, that low, clever flying makes predictions stumble. But the room does not mock the myth. It understands what the myth is trying to say, which is that the old safety in altitude and habit has been repossessed by someone else. Always is a poor word for that repossession. Often is the smaller, truer thing, and often is enough to change a planner's mind. The second myth hands the entire miracle to a single piece, as if complexity were an insult to wonder. In this telling, the proximity fuse becomes a wizard that chooses the instant of death without assistance. The cool room gives the fuse its due. It points out that a near miss once counted as a failure and now often counts as a wound, and that the arithmetic of lethality does not sneer at such transformations. But the room also insists on chronology. A fuse cannot shepherd a shell into the correct square of sky. It waits faithfully for the shell to arrive where the prediction told it to be, and then does its fraction of the work. The strange fairness of the system lies in that division. An invisible beam measures, an analog brain wagers on the next few seconds, metal arms obey, and the fuse dignifies near enough by turning it into good enough. The honor belongs to the loop, not to any single saint in the calendar. A third myth attributes to radar a kind of sorcery, as if beams themselves scalded metal and seared flesh. This mistake comes from the understandable human habit of mistaking the invisible for the supernatural. Beams do nothing to tissue at these powers and distances, except report on its position. The injury comes from the fragments of steel that obey chemistry and momentum rather than rumor. Recognizing this does not diminish radar. On the contrary, it awards the technology its true nobility. It turns the unknown into the known with such confidence that machines can act upon it as if it were certain. There is a kind of moral cleanliness in that. It removes bravado from killing and replaces it with arithmetic, which unnerves those who prefer valor to numbers, but steadies those who must plan the defense of a harbor or a bridge. Then there is the rumor that technology erases courage, that it allows men to sit far from danger and issue commands without consequence, that it turns fighting into administration. The rebuttal to this is the simplest one in the whole room. Walk the line of a battery at 2 in the morning in bad weather and count shoulders. Watch men carry weight they did not invent. Feel, with your palm on a mount, the same vibration that will travel up through a pilot's feet a minute later when fragments find his wing. If the loop has introduced calm, it has also introduced duty's most exhausting form, repetition under pressure. Courage here is not made of charges and flags. It is made of not allowing impatience to ruin alignment, not allowing laziness to let a connector corrode, not allowing boredom to steal rehearsal's edge. Technology does not spare men from this. It binds them to it. If myths flourish on one side of the wire, denial blooms on the other. There is a soft song that says the system's victories are exaggerations, that kill claims are lies told by men who want a medal, that stories of predictive fire are theatre. The cool room has a shelf for this too. It holds reports written at the time by people who had nothing to gain from polishing the numbers and every reason to be suspicious of pretty claims. And those reports show the same contours the stories show: quicker ladders to effective bursts, tighter patterns at the right heights, changes in route and altitude by attackers that betray respect more than fear. Denial is more dignified when it is a caution against propaganda than when it is a refusal to read. The smaller, truer thing is that the system worked often enough, and predictably enough, to make professional men on both sides change their behavior. There is one last distortion that deserves kindness rather than correction. It is the habit of calling the whole enterprise a miracle, as if men had been rescued by something that arrived from outside history. This habit exists because standing in the director trailer while the needles settle does feel like participating in inevitability. But inevitability is just the sum of a million decisions made by people whose names did not make it into anyone's elegy. An engineer who argued for a different gear ratio so a mount would stop overshooting by a hair. A quartermaster who learned to stock the exact connector that always failed in the rain. A teacher in a cold tent who refused to pass. A student who had not yet learned to trim wind with his fingertips rather than his shoulders. If you must keep the word miracle, let it name the way human stubbornness, applied to detail, creates effects that look like magic at a distance. Put the myths down with care. They were useful in the first hours after shock, and they are poetic in a way that numbers cannot be. But leave the room with the smaller truths in your pocket. The loop is not a spell. It is a choreography whose steps are teachable, repeatable, breakable, and repairable. It does not blind pilots. It does not guess. It does not boast. It measures, predicts, obeys, and detonates. Once you have accepted that calm sentence, you are ready to meet the people who built the conditions for that sentence to be true and to stay true under the pressure of history. Behind the dish and the guns stood rooms without windows where decisions travelled as memos and budgets rather than as shells. In those rooms, the work looked like bureaucracy, which is to say, it looked like the only mechanism a large nation owns for turning invention into habit. A laboratory on a riverbank built prototypes under a schedule that felt like panic and ceremony at once. Officers in uniforms, the colour of wet paper, sat with men in tweed and agreed on what could be delivered by spring, what could be risked in front of a skeptical field test board, what secrets would be carried in locked cases, and which would be allowed to ride unescorted on trains because time was the greater enemy. Words like priority and allocation governed lives. The first decision, and in some ways the most courageous, was to treat a university laboratory like a factory for ideas and to feed it with problems at an industrial rate. The second was to match those ideas to institutions that could buy things by the mile while still caring about millimeters. Procurement officers learned a new language. They had to purchase not just barrels and springs but oscillators and klystrons, servo amplifiers and resolvers, rubber boots for connectors that would be asked to survive a winter's worth of mud. They had to write contracts that rewarded reliability rather than merely delivery, because the loop punished the weak link without mercy. A gun that shot well but could not be steered was as useless as a fine violin with no strings. A flawless radar that could not stand up to a bad generator was a luxury toy. The paper had to teach the factories these truths without sounding like a sermon. Training manuals are governance written in the imperative. Someone had to decide how many hours an operator should spend watching range rate until he could hear intention in the numbers. Someone had to forbid shortcuts, soft-hearted instructors, always invent for tired students. Someone had to decide that a battery would not be called ready until a checklist of calibrations had been completed 3 days in a row without error, not because the list was holy, but because 3 days proved that the loop could be built on demand rather than coaxed into being by luck. Syllabi grew in quiet stacks. Instructors learned how to use boredom like a chisel. Men who had never loved mathematics discovered that their own lives depended on tiny wheels agreeing with one another. Field doctrine brought a separate species of choice. You cannot protect everything. You can protect what matters in ways that make an enemy's life expensive. Commanders wrote their own equations of value. A port that handled fuel earned more guns than a park that handled feelings. A bridge whose loss would rip a timetable got wired into the loop, while a similar bridge in a quiet county received older, noisier tools. It is the nature of fairness in war to look like cruelty in the moment. The governance of deployment admitted this without apology and kept its eyes on consequence. The minutes saved by the loop mattered most in places where minutes were already a currency. That is where the batteries went. Secrecy has its own governance. With the proximity fuse in particular, decision-makers played a long game with their own impatience. The temptation to flood the front with brilliance has killed more projects than thrift ever did. To withhold a thing until it can survive capture, until its use will change the season rather than merely tomorrow, is to accept the pain of listening to men ask for help and tell them to wait. Papers were signed that allowed the fuse to flourish first, where recovery by a clever enemy would be least likely, and only later where the need felt most immediate. It is hard to run a war on restraint. Harder still not to. The loop's maturity in the last year of the fighting carries, inside its efficiency, the memory of all those delayed announcements. Every system that scales must survive the small humiliations that attend scale. A shipment of connectors goes to the wrong depot and sits in a warehouse while men in a field improvisationally wrap canvas around their cable heads because the rain does not wait for procurement. A brilliant instructor falls ill, and his replacement, though competent, fails to notice a flaw in the way students rest their palms that will introduce a tiny bias at exactly the wrong part of the track. A mount arrives with a bearing that sings under load but behaves on the inspection stand, and the inspector, overworked and underslept, initialed the form because the schedule is not a theory. Governance absorbs these and finds ways to make recurrence more expensive than compliance. If it cannot, it changes the plan rather than lying to itself about enforcement. The most honest compliment paid to governance is that after a while, the extraordinary becomes ordinary. Men stop telling visitors that the radar can lock onto a single aircraft as if it were a fairy tale and start complaining, in affectionate tones, about the quality of coffee in the tracking van. Leaders stop writing long letters to one another about whether the director can be taught to conscripts and start writing short ones about how many spare tubes must ride with each battery if we are to keep the lesson alive through winter. The distance between invention and dull routine is exactly the distance between brilliance and safety. When the loop arrived at routine, governance could finally stop being a crisis and start being maintenance. Inside the enemy's planning rooms, the echo of these choices was audible in altered maps. Routes bent away from defended sectors, not because myth had paralyzed pilots, but because the cost curves had shifted and professionalism demanded thrift with lives and machines. Altitudes changed. Timing changed. Attacks thickened or spread according to new mathematics. This is governance's last and most secret joy, to have altered the world without raising its voice. The dish turns, the needles settle, the mounts obey, the fuses finish their work, and somewhere a colonel scratches out a line on a map because the risk has grown teeth. That scratched line is not theatre. It is policy meeting physics and shaking hands. What began as a suitcase of secrets and a promise among strangers resolved into a grammar that ordinary men could speak under moons and in rain. The grammar governed not with slogans but with checklists, not with romance but with duty, and yet it produced moments in the sky that felt like prophecy to those who met them. There is dignity in that kind of government. It wastes little, despises theatrics, and puts the heavy parts of the work where they belong, in hands that will be asked to lift again tomorrow. The next time the loop sings in the night and a page of air glittering just ahead of an aircraft becomes a lesson in humility, the event will look like fate. In truth, it will be the end of a long chain of decisions that were small enough to be made and large enough to matter. Crates have their own cadence. They thud from a rail car to a platform, from a platform to a flatbed, from a flatbed to a muddy laydown yard where a corporal with a clipboard makes a universe out of numbers on packing lists. The radar arrives disguised as ordinary wood and stenciled caution. The director comes in a stout box that sweats grease through the seams. The mounts, being proud, travel uncovered and demand a crane's steady patience. Before any of it can make a sky, smaller, it has to make a field into a workshop, and that transformation is the first test the system ever takes. Men string lines to mark where the cables will run and sink timbers to keep trucks from chewing the position into a pond. The power truck noses into a deliberate corner. When the generator fires the first time, it does not feel like technology. It feels like shelter. Assembly is ritual, not improvisation. The radar's pedestal drinks bolts and shims until the dish's axis agrees with a bubble level that has settled for the third time the same way. The director trailer's racks accept their glass with both hands, each tube seated as if it were an egg that had chosen to glow. The mounts get their bearings purged and repacked until a senior sergeant, who does not throw compliments, admits they sing instead of grind. Wiring is the quiet drama everyone underestimates. Rubber boots slide over heads, connectors mate with a satisfying click, and the first continuity test walks a current around the position like a watchman. At the end of day 1, the battery exists in outline. At the end of day 2, it exists in circuits. By day 3, it has opinions. Training is where the parts learn one another's names. The search set hands a contact to the tracking dish in a voice that will not be hurried. The tracking dish proves it can keep a steel dragonfly centered against a sky buzzing with insects. The director absorbs the numbers and, like a good host, makes the first moves without narrating every choice. The mounts accept control and follow without sulking. The pits rehearse the exchange of shells until it is a language, not a choreography. A lieutenant asks for the handoff again because perfection on a Tuesday evening in drizzle tends to survive Saturday night when nothing goes according to the manual. Calibration becomes a kind of prayer. Every morning the repeaters must match. The dials must return to 0 without wandering. The dish must find a reference, star, and salute in silence. Faults bloom like weeds and get plucked before the roots thicken. A cable jacket shows a bruise where a truck rolled wrong. A klystron drifts when the generator's mood sours. A mount's elevation circuit develops a tremor that only appears when the barrel points over a certain hedgerow. The beauty of the system is not that it lacks such frailties, but that it admits them, catalogues them, and corrects them without theatre. The quartermaster who for once has the exact spare will not be remembered in any history, yet the exact spare is how history keeps its promises. When requisition paths snarl, men splice, borrow, and trade in the underground economy of functioning units. Pride insists on doing things by the book. War insists the book be written in pencil. At last, the battery asks to be believed. A tow target drones at altitude, dragging a sleeve that looks insolent in the wind. The dish finds it. The director's needles stop hunting. The mount's motors hum like content animals. The first bursts climb a careful ladder, and then the pattern folds into the path like a hand catching a ball. The sleeve stutters and tears. Men who do not clap allow themselves a private nod. The commander signs the page that declares the position alive, and a map somewhere gains a small circle that stands for a new difficulty overhead. Only then does the place begin to feel like a post rather than a construction site. Only then do the crates turn into furniture. When orders move the battery forward, the whole machine remembers how to be a caravan. Cables get coiled into black wreaths, dishes nestle into their own shadows, and the director's glass rides like a passenger everyone agrees to protect. The arrival at a new field repeats the rite, only faster, because repetition makes speed decent. In time, the system acquires the personality of the men who keep it. Some positions are immaculate and quiet, their cables braided like hair. Others are loud, competent and a little feral, their generators swearing at the weather and their crews swearing back. Both kinds work. Both kinds, when the sky darkens with intention, will close the same loop and send the same message upward. We see you. We can do something about it. It begins with a map that looks ordinary until someone draws a finger along a line and says, "There." The route is not reckless, only familiar. The formation will pass within reach of a harbour's careful anger and trust altitude to make wisdom out of habit. In the gun pits, men button cuffs and knock mud from soles against steel steps. In the tracking van, a young operator adjusts the chair. He always finds too high and pretends the headset does not pinch. A watch is tapped. A last cigarette is ground into a tidy grave. There is nothing uncanny about the dish's first turn or the controller's first words. The uncanny part is how unhurried everything sounds when the contact arrives. "Lock," says the voice. The same way it says good morning. Over water, the aircraft wear light differently. The plan position scope shows a tidier echo, a confidence that land rarely allows, and the rate of change needle writes intention without stutter. The director's hand wheels turn less and less. The mounts begin their low animal song. In the far distance, a string of bright beads climbs the air like an impatient necklace, and then a second string appears ahead of where the first predicts, and the sky acquires grammar. In cockpits, a dozen gloved hands adjust a dozen throttles by a hair, not because a man wills caution, but because the body refuses to be casual in the presence of punctuation. The first plan breaks like a wave. The formation tilts, each aircraft paying respect to the other's right to continue existing. The second plan, the one made of reflex and unwritten rules, unfolds automatically. It used to work. What the ground does now is not new to them, but looks new from above. The ladder of bursts does not chase you, it awaits you. A slash of glitter opens a hand in the air before your nose and then closes it as you pass through, and you learn without vocabulary that bursts can be invitations. A fraction late, you yank harder than the leader would like, and fragments write their small, impolite script across the wing you cherish. The aircraft tells the truth in its bones, a tremor here, a heaviness there, a yaw that is not yours. The voice you rely on says something professional and low, and the words come wrapped in a note you have not heard from him before. The altimeter unwinds with poor manners. The geometry you studied the first year of flight school wakes up and demands rent. On the ground, the loop closes further. The director trims wind with an almost affectionate motion, feeding the mount a spoonful of calm. The operator rides a blip that has begun to scratch with debris and refuses to let the noise persuade him to let go. The commander speaks less and listens more because the orchestra is in time by itself. The next pattern in the air arrives not as an escalation, but as an inevitability. The proximity fuses have found their hour. The bright knots reveal their secret at last. They do not need an appointment at the exact corner of a cube to be effective. They need only the right room and a good sense of when to cough. The men in the pits feel it in their feet, a hollow in the recoil that always attends the moment when work turns into result. When a bomber slips out of formation and goes lame, the news spreads without radios. It is in the way 3 aircraft widen their intervals as if a friend has started to limp. It is in the way the damaged machine's silhouette changes personality against the light. From the ground, it looks like a truth being admitted. In the tracking van, the blip does something that always feels personal. It hesitates. The solution holds as if it knows how men think when they need a little kindness, and then it moves to where necessity will take them. One more string, not cruelty, closure. Hours later, the story will be told on both sides, in voices that avoid adjectives. The crew that made the field will say the bursts were in front, that the first ladder was normal and the second one understood them too well, that the air glittered where they wished it would not. The battery that watched will record rounds fired, elevation bands, settling times, and note, without joy, that the wind's mischief at 600 meters is not as bad as it was last week. What neither log captures is the texture of the surprise. It lives in shoulders, in how men stand after they sit, in how they look at the sky as if it has emptied of secrets and filled with rules. Shock is not noise. It is the moment when the world stops being vague. When night falls, the dish points down and dozes, the mounts cool with little clicks, and the field smells of oil, and the modest satisfaction of work that made sense. The harbour lies as it did in the morning, but some line on a foreign table will not be flown again. That is the measure of the hour. A battery does not end a war. It edits it. The temptation at day's end is to put everything in a ledger and believe the ledger can hold it. Some of it will. Engagements that once opened with long, wasteful ranging now reached the first credible pattern in half the time. The fraction of bursts that mattered climbed because near enough had been upgraded by a fuse that did not require a key and a guess. The altitude at which attack felt inexpensive to the intruder rose until thrift advised a detour. Claims reported a steadier conversion of metal into decision. After-action notes began to sound like engineers writing poetry against their will. Settling times reduced, solution retention through maneuvers improved. Aimpoint stability excellent in Sector 4. Planners, who care less for lyric than for trend, moved their pencil lines accordingly. There are less flattering numbers that deserve same stage. Line of sight remains a tyrant. Place a ridge between dish and target, and the most elegant computation in the county will not lay a hand on the sky. Weather, invited to every fight and loyal to none, complicates everything a radar would like to be simple. Heavy rain roughens the scope, snow steals contrast, fog damps morale. Clutter from ships, steelworks, and rail yards writes its own ballet on the screen and asks a tired operator to keep faith through confusion. Operators who have not slept or eaten properly see intention in noise and lose confidence in clean signals. Commanders who move batteries too often for the sake of appearances pay the price in alignment checks done in haste and missed faults that wait for the hour of need. Even in the clear, low-level intruders teach humility. The geometry that favors prediction at height can be defeated at hedge top by terrain that breaks beams and hides motion. A clever pilot who shortens the horizon with earth and structure forces the loop to fight with one eye closed. Jamming appears with the same inevitability as any countermeasure to a measured system. Sometimes it is crude and easy to read around. Sometimes it is artful and turns the set into a liar for a minute that matters. Doctrine adapts. Additional eyes help. The loop learns to share responsibility among searchlights, observers, and radio pickets without losing the elegance that makes it worth defending. The most honest successes in the ledger are not the enemies brought down, but the behaviors changed. Altitudes shift across a season. Routes bend away from defended corridors. Attack windows narrow to night, or weather because daylight through a measured sky has become too expensive. None of these can be assigned neatly to a single battery's work. They belong to a season of competence, in which enough positions functioned as promised that professionals on the other side performed the arithmetic and conceded the problem. Surprise matures into respect, and respect is what alters timetables. In this same register of honesty live the limits that policy cannot wish away. Industrialized defense requires industrialized supply. Tubes burn out. Bearings need grease. Ammunition has to arrive in the right lot numbers if the fuses are to keep their reputation. Instructors must be replaced without losing the tone of their patience. Helpers become teachers. The system is not a statue, it is a garden. Left alone, it goes wild, then hungry, then dead. Tended, it looks like inevitability. No figure in a column captures the nightly stubbornness that separates those two outcomes. What the numbers finally prove is not invincibility but reliability. The loop works often enough, quickly enough, under enough kinds of pressure, that serious men trust it when they draw circles on a map and say, "This is covered." That trust is the rarest commodity in war. It cannot be bought outright. It is rented by the hour, paid in calibrations, and revoked by carelessness. In the year when the technology and the training caught up with one another, the rent was paid with better regularity than the enemy had expected. Shock at first engagement became, by season's end, a quiet recalibration of risk. Some myths died there. Most importantly, habits did. Long after the last bright knots of air have drifted into memory, the most durable relic is not a recovered fragment or a photograph of men leaning against a barrel. It is a change in posture. Aircrews who once treated altitude as a talisman learned to speak in contingencies. They asked not just how high, but where the ground could measure them with confidence. Not just how straight, but how predictable. The old dance with barrages, the one taught by elders who had survived a different season, was retired with more affection than regret. In its place came a new instinct that felt, at first, like caution and matured into craft. To be measured is to be anticipated. To be anticipated is to be answered. The shock did not make men timid. It made them exact. On the ground, the loop's success altered ambition. Once commanders felt the difference between guessing and knowing, they became greedy for certainty in other domains. Radios that had been tolerated as temperamental cousins were brought into the family of systems and taught manners. Plotting and reporting ceased to be personalities and became processes. The battery that had once been an island guarding a harbour grew tendrils into neighbouring posts until the coast behaved like a single nervous system. The lesson was not that machines replaced judgment. It was that judgment, given fresh measurements at the speed of seconds rather than minutes, becomes something sharper than hunch and humbler than arrogance. In the larger ledger of the war, the change wrote itself in pencil because victory never belongs to one technology, yet the pencil line is legible. Certain raids were softened enough to spare bridges that mattered the next week. Certain harbours kept their hours when hours were rationed. Certain cities slept more, or at least better, because patterns that had once wandered like gossip now arrived like schedules. On the other side of the wire, routes that had once looked efficient gained a cost that could not be ignored. Skilled crews who were too valuable to gamble on a measured sky were held back for nights and weather, and even then they flew with a new translation of risk humming in the bones. After the shooting, the loop refused to disappear. The grammar that linked finding to prediction to obedience to detonation became the vernacular of defenses that would outlive propellers and pistons. Radar married other radars. Directors learned to speak with weapons that did not throw shells. The idea that a small room full of screens and nerves could alter a horizon became normal. Men who had once tuned range gates with cold fingers found themselves called back to teach a peacetime generation that made the world's airways safe and its borders legible. The moral does not require trumpets. It needs only the photograph of a dish at rest and a mount gone to seed, and the knowledge that, When called, both could be made to speak coherently again in a few days, because the method had been learned too well to be lost. As for the POWs who first gave the shock its name, their words ended up in files and footnotes, translated into the language of analysts who prefer nouns like capability and effect. But the human scale of their testimony still catches at the throat. A man does not forget the instant he realizes the sky can make a plan against him. That realization is not terror so much as education delivered rudely. It teaches that the future is not a fog into which one disappears by speed alone. It is a place the ground can visit in advance, lay a table, and wait. To have flown through such hospitality and lived is to acquire a new respect for rooms you will never see. If the story needs one last sentence, let it be a plain one. The surprise was not the size of the guns or the volume of steel they could hurl. It was the quietness of the prediction that guided them, the modesty with which measurement did its work, and the way men of average heroism learned to keep that modesty alive shift after shift. Shock, properly understood, is the sensation history makes when it changes its preferred tool. Here it chose a loop. It will not be the last time.